Right now, we do want to turn to a conversation that's happening right here in Georgia and around the country, and it focuses on data centers, the growing, burgeoning industry that has taken root here in Georgia as one of the quickly becoming preeminent locations around the country for these data centers that power and really provide the technological backbone of this growing AI industry that is touching so much of our daily lives now. We want to bring in Connie Di Cicco, who is the legislative director at Georgia Conservation Voters. Connie, I know you and your organization are paying close attention to the data and the data center industry and some legislation making its way through the state capitol, correct?
Yes, thank you for having me. Yes, we are. We're watching this every single day.
And Connie, for folks who may not be totally familiar, what is the position of the Georgia conservation voters on data centers and on them coming to Georgia?
I'm glad you asked. Georgia Conservation Voters, we're not against data centers. We would like for data centers to be good neighbors. I mean, I do think that there's a way for data centers to help Georgia grow and participate in our economic growth here. We like to say that Georgia is open for business. There's a great way for data centers to participate in that growth and make it sustainable, even clean, and to participate and give back to our communities here.
I sense there is maybe a but at the end of that sentence somewhere, though.
You know, I have been saying for a while now that Georgians need to value Georgia in the same way that the centers seem to be doing. We have a lot to offer here, and we don't really need to be giving this away for free. And we do this a lot, particularly with this industry. We have been giving away a lot to $1 billion corporate industry, um, and we don't need to be doing that. We have tax incentives to this industry that total $2.5 billion a year right now. Studies have shown, audits have shown that 70% of these data centers would have come without these tax incentives. They use tremendous amounts of water and energy. And this is at a time when a lot of Georgians are looking at their own bills and they are having a hard time making their own ends meet. And these are also industries that we pay for their services. So we are subsidizing them in a multitude of ways that we don't really need to be doing. And I think that that's the crux of the but that you're asking about. Georgia is a tremendous place. A lot of industries come here. We don't necessarily need to be giving away things.
Connie, let me ask you two questions here. I appreciate your
Mhm.
answer. One about sort of the economics of this ongoing conversation, and another about the environmental aspects of the conversation. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those are sort of the two key pillars, or some of the key pillars of this conversation we've seen playing out at the state capitol, at local planning and zoning boards across the state. This is something that a lot of people are paying attention to. I want to ask you first about the environmental concerns that you raised, others have raised. I have also spoken with folks within the data center industry, and they argue that they, as an industry, have an economic incentive to make their data centers as environmentally efficient as possible. It just, they say, makes good business for them to be as efficient with the inputs that they're using, including power and water and other sources of energy. To those folks in the data center industry who say they're doing all they can to be good stewards and they're getting better and better, what would you say to them?
They are getting better and better, and that's part of the technology. I think transparency is the key here. And if you, a lot of it needs to begin with the transparency, and we do need to know about the water and the energy. When you have a lot of them, that translates to grid resiliency. And that is also another piece that we also have to be keeping in mind. There's another larger piece to this too, which is the projections that are just within the next 5 years. And this has to do with Georgia Power asking for the 10 gigawatts, so 10,000 megawatts for this projected growth, the majority of which is for the data centers. That's the energy burden that we are talking about. And that folds back into making things more resilient, the transparency part of all of this, and where, if all of those contracts go unfulfilled, where does that energy burden land? It lands mostly on the ratepayers and not the data centers themselves. But to your point about all of these natural resources, to fulfill those contracts and that projection that Georgia Power is asking about, it requires bringing on more fossil fuels and things like coal plants that we were going to retire. That is a massive projection. And those natural resources, we had thought we had retired those. So those are now going to come back online. And I think that's a very big concern for organizations like ours.
Connie, we're a little short on time, but I do want to make sure I get to ask you these last two questions here. We talked about the
Sure.
environmental aspect of the conversation. Let's talk about the money. You've taken issue with some of the economic incentives and the tax incentives that have been given to the data center industry. Legislators, lawmakers, many times when they are voting for these kinds of tax incentives, they argue that those incentives bring jobs to local economies across the state and they boost economic development. And that reasoning, they say, makes the tax incentives worth it. What would you say to those lawmakers?
The devil's in the details. These are typically industries that bring less than a McDonald's in terms of jobs. They are buildings that don't house that many jobs once they're built. They do require a lot of construction up front. That might be 300 jobs, 500 jobs, but that's only to build them. And then after that, they really require very little maintenance or jobs once they're built.
Connie, this is maybe a tricky question to answer in 60 seconds, but we're up
Okay.
against a hard clock here.
Okay.
If you can wave the magic wand under the Gold Dome and get the lawmakers under the Gold Dome to pass legislation that would be the ideal legislation for Georgia conservation voters to address data centers, what would it look like?
Ratepayer protections that make the causers pay for what they're causing, that's something that would give so many Georgians a lot of assurance for these build outs, and also transparency. That's foundational for a lot of environmental work and tells us what we can expect and gives you statewide, that starts statewide collaboration for a lot of the work that follows after this. And I think that is those two things working together really give you a good start for going forward.
Connie Di Cicco, the legislative director at Georgia Conservation Voters. Connie, thank you for your time and your perspective.
Thank you so much.